it can involve all user-to-user messaging. So that might be through Fortnite, Coldplay, Line of Duty, all those sorts of things, Minecraft, anything where strangers can access our children.
So the British government have just had a debate about the under 16 social media ban, and to be honest, it's absolutely insane. So in this video, we're going to go through some of the points that were raised in favour of the under 16 social media ban, and to be honest, some of the stupidity as well.
There is one issue where they're not equivocal, and that is social media bans, social media harms. Parents are overwhelmingly concerned about social media, their children's the risk of their children's access to social media. About 93% of parents tell us they think social media is harmful.
So this was one of the points that were raised to kind of drill home the fact that social media should be banned for under 16s in the UK, essentially presenting the idea that overwhelmingly parents agree that social media can be harmful, which in my opinion is a very similar thing to the argument that cars can be dangerous. Yes, they can, but it doesn't mean that we should ban them all. I think raising the point that it's agreeable that social media can be harmful is a very weak argument in order to get the message across. We know it can be harmful. The arguments here is that the government should not be intervening with stuff that parents can do themselves, and also more to the point, legal of-age adults should not be handing over their identity to access websites. That is insane.
We know that there is an absolute epidemic of CSAM on the internet, naked pictures of our children everywhere. The CSAM reported from the Internet Watch Foundation was the worst on record. It went up 7% just from last year, over 300,000 sites just that they found of child sexual abuse material.
Now this is a very interesting point that needs more context. The actual study that was referenced there that contains obviously indecent images of children was actually sourced from the dark web. That's where all of this was found. Now by introducing a social media ban, you are going to be pushing more children to utilise VPNs and, of course, the dark web. It's also worth noting that on the surface web, all data that points to inappropriate pictures of children actually stems from parents themselves posting pictures of their children in the bath and stuff like that, which is, to be honest, insane. I don't know why people feel the need to do that, but it actually would appear that on the surface web, the internet we use day to day, that would actually be the biggest problem. Parents. Now the next point is about basically trying to draw the line. At what age should someone access social media? Where should we draw that line as of what age is acceptable for someone to access social media?
If we work under the assumption there's plenty of evidence for the damage it does to children, there is a risk then that when kids turn 17, what's really the difference between a child who's 16, 364 days old versus 17 years old? And is there a risk of the floodgates opening, essentially a cliff edge, when a child turns 17 and the potential impact on their mental health as a result of that?
I struggle with the cliff edge analogy.
Yeah.
If we are associating the use of social media to cliff edges, then it's predominantly harmful because we don't want children near cliff edges.
In my opinion, that is not a rebuttal to the very valid question. And I think the reality of it is so much more serious than that. If you're basically depriving people of access to social media, whether it's for their benefit or not, the second you actually give them access to those tools and the ability to browse social media and utilize it in multiple ways, they are going to find themselves with lack of education, lack of understanding, and also find themselves making mistakes, not trusting the right people, and actually not having the mental tool set to deal with social media responsibly. If this law does come into effect, I think a lot of adolescents and 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds are going to find themselves having their first experiences of social media very negative, because the reality is you're going to basically be dropping people off that cliff edge into an unknown world that they do not understand. And we can actually see an example of this with some older age groups. A lot of older adults, people in the 60s, 70s, 80s that have their first experiences with social media in the past couple of years tend to more easily fall for things like AI, tend to be more trusting, which is why there's a whole scam industry made up of people pretending to be your nephew from Africa or some prince emailing you. Because of that lack of access to internet infrastructure and contextual internet information that allows people to be more educated in the way that they use social media. I think this stuff is very, very important to talk about out at the very minimum. I'm not saying that necessarily there's a right or wrong to those points there. What I'm saying is that clearly data exists from people that didn't have social media, that now do have social media, and we should look into that data and see what evidence that provides for the associated harms. Now, before we get to the next point, and this is where things really start to take a bit of a turn for the worse in this, there's a lot to get through. But very quickly, if you're looking for a fantastic VPN, make sure to check out private internet access at the link down below. With private internet access, one subscription will work across all of your devices, and they really do respect your privacy. They simply do not keep any logs of what you do utilizing their VPN. With that link down below, you can get yourselves 4 months free and 86% off. And of course, it is the best way to support the channel. Now let's get back to the video. So this is where things start to take a real nosedive. Now, one of the things that's often repeated by the people that are in favour of the ban is that they're basically leading their viewpoint just based on the science, i.e. the science says that when people reach a certain age, that's when their brains are fully formed. And actually, the science is different for men and women, and this raises another problem.
And that, I think, is incredibly wise to try to aim to protect children from social media exposure, especially in that age group.
Yeah, but science would tell us 16 for girls, probably later for boys in that stage.
Well,
perhaps you could write to us about that.
Yeah, if you could write to us.
Notice how quickly they tried to move along the point there. Effectively, they said throughout the whole thing that they're just basically letting the science of kind of like children's psychology and what age people's brains are fully formed lead their viewpoint on this. Then when corrected in the fact that actually men and women mature at different ages and their brains stop developing at different ages, very quickly the point gets moved along, because this shows that it's not really being led by the science, it's being led by a desire to get an end result, and the science is kind of being used as an excuse to get there. Now, the next point we need to get onto is actually probably one of the more important ones, and it's kind of foreshadowing for what's to come for the rest of the video. So throughout this debate, the people that are for a social media ban have constantly referenced studies and polls and data about how social media affects children. Now, actually, there's some more information about that data.
You know, we are the Science and Innovation Tech Committee, so we're really trying to look at evidence.
Yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to come back to attitudes. I similarly did a survey of 500 14 to 16-year-olds in Milton Keynes and came up with very similar outcomes in terms of what they're doing. But I went further and found out where these approaches were happening and where they were seeing damaging material. And they weren't what we would consider necessarily social media. So I wanted to talk to you guys about that. So the platforms that they were getting the approaches from strangers, they were seeing the damaging material, were overwhelmingly YouTube and Roblox, which are not considered necessarily within the definition of social media material. Are you suggesting that we ban those? I'm trying to understand better what you mean by a social media ban, how you would define social media.
I'm jumping in here. I'm jumping in. If you're expecting at any point throughout this video that they're going to be able to clarify what they mean by social media, you are wrong. It's not going to happen. In fact, this is going to come up a little bit later in the video. They are simply not able to define what they mean by social media. Now, a recurring theme throughout this whole debate is essentially what is social media, and also the data alone saying that internet bad for children doesn't actually work when it comes to legislation, because there's no clear outline of what is actually social media. But also as well, when you dive deeper into many of the studies that have been carried out about kind of like online harms for children, and parents talk about Roblox, the biggest concern that parents actually have about Roblox, I have to be 100% honest here, is parents not really understanding Roblox. A good example of this is that you'll see news articles about how children have received explicit videos through platforms online, and then it will go on to talk about the harms of Roblox. Now, with a lot of this kind of fear-mongering in the media, a lot of people, including parents, have kind of just jumped to the conclusion that if their children use games like Roblox, they're going to be seeing all sorts of inappropriate images. When, of course, that's not how it works, and that's not like, there's very, very few. It is a problem. I'm not going to deny it's a problem, but there's a very limited number of cases where people have had conversations on Roblox, and that conversation has led to that child and that adult talking off platform. Now, this is where Roblox have actually stepped up their protections, and they've introduced things like like parental controls on it. So if your child plays Roblox, you can just turn on parental controls, and essentially they're limited in who they can play with, who they can talk to, and you have to kind of manually approve people. And effectively, you can control that online environment. Now, to be fair, these changes were relatively recent, but this kind of comes back to the argument of parental controls. They exist, there's just no education on it for parents. And I'm actually, at the moment, I'm working on a video series, not sure when it's going to come out, but it's kind of going to be like a 10-part series talking about how parents can actually keep their children safer online, regardless of laws or any of this stuff, more about actual things that you can do as parents. So let me know in the comments if you want to see that. I'm working on it. I'm not sure when it's going to come out, but if you really want to see it soon, I'll speed up that process.
Yes, and Australia clearly went through this process, and perhaps imperfectly, once they had decided that they wanted what they called a ban on social media. They then had to discuss, exactly what they meant by social media, and which platforms were in and which platforms were out. Often WhatsApp is the most contentious, one of the most contentious platforms, tending to fall outside of the remit of social media. But young people themselves, and I dare say members of Parliament, would recognise the intensity of WhatsApp and the potential for harm and strangers to contact young people through encrypted messages.
Now, this point here is also entirely wrong. Like, I don't know anyone that considers WhatsApp to be social media. Especially in the UK, people just use that for texting. If you say to someone, I'll text you, you probably mean WhatsApp. WhatsApp is the biggest kind of like texting thing in the UK. Like in the UK, iMessage isn't actually as big as it is in the US, like as a percentage. And also platforms like WhatsApp really aren't social media. You're not posting like a status feed. You're not sharing videos and reels to like publicly out there to loads of people. Yes, there are stories, I guess. And for me, it's a really, really weird proposition to put that forward as social media, because to actually message someone on WhatsApp, you need their contact information. You need their phone number. You can't just WhatsApp someone randomly. It's not like adding someone as a friend on Facebook. That's not how it works.
I had the pleasure of meeting most of the parents of these children in a workshop that we did, and what was really clear, both from the survey that we did of children, was not 14 to 16-year-olds didn't want, absolutely recognise the harms, didn't want a ban, but did want more regulation. Similarly, with parents, there was this view that a ban, those that felt that social media couldn't be regulated wanted a ban, and those that felt that you could improve their child's online experience wanted to improve their child's online experience. I wanted to see, in your kind of work that you've been doing around your surveys of parentkind, have you gone on to ask those kinds of questions of what is the preferred option to make the online space safe, or people feeling that that's just not possible, there's no level of online safety that you can have for people under 16?
It is fair to say that there will always be differences of opinions amongst parents as a cohort. They are inevitably a large cohort, so there will always be nuance. However, I think when we speak to parents and when we survey parents, about 2/3, 67%, say they support a full ban on social media. And they say that because it gives them the clarity. It effectively makes you guys the bad guys, not them. It makes and it's the same with things like the age of consent.
Yes, so the government want to replace the job of parents and basically institute a law where parents can just say, well, the law says so, that's it, I don't need to be a parent anymore. Which is furthermore to the point that parents should be parents, the government shouldn't be doing the parenting. Now this is actually also really interesting, because all the surveys that I've seen that have been put out in relation to social media bans by organisations that want a social media ban don't have different questions and paragraphs and options out there for alternatives. What do you think would be a good alternative as an example? None of that exists. All of these surveys pertain to the idea that a social media ban is the only option. You're basically coaxing the correct answers out of it. I think it's also important to talk about the fact that this is a snapshot of where this is at today. A poll on something that hasn't happened generally is based on things like virtue signalling. And virtue signalling is a big part of wanting to make a better society, whether for the right reasons or wrong reasons. But saying things like, actually, I think we should protect all the children, we should do this, we should do that, we should have bans, makes a lot of people feel better about their job as a parent. And that's going to be a controversial opinion, but saying that you're doing everything you can to lobby your government to do the right thing for children makes you feel better. And it might even be the right answer. I know, controversial for me to say that, but the reality is you can't endorse something being in effect when it hasn't been in effect. You can speak against it whilst it hasn't been in effect, like an under 16 social media ban, because you already know what it's led to. You know the results of it, and even with all of the nasty byproducts of it, there are a lot of reasons why we shouldn't be handing over copies of our passport or biometric scans to access websites.
It is likely that young people would circumvent any such ban. Obviously, it's talked about VPNs and so on, but also this definitional question of simply moving to something else which we haven't prescribed. How risky is that?
I think there is imperfection built into a ban. A ban provides clarity to parents, but clearly there will still be a sort of cat and mouse process going on.
Now, of course, here they acknowledge that the reality is even with the ban in place, it's a legal framework, but people will still utilize VPNs to get around it. And to be honest, fair enough. But later, actually, in this, I didn't show it in this video because there's no point. It was just a one-liner. But they said that as a side product of this, they are also looking at things like VPN bans, which I'm sure you guys are aware of anyway.
What assessment have you made of alternatives to banning? Because of no one could have heard the evidence you've put this morning without being concerned about it. But is a ban the only way? Would there be restrictions that would work, that might achieve the same outcomes that we want to see, which might be more effective?
On behalf of parents, we speak for parents, we support the ban because of the clarity it gives to parents. There are clearly other options presented in the department's consultation, for example, curfews or further regulation around social media. We would be troubled, I think, by those alternatives because they don't give parents in particular, who are ultimately put in the position of policing these things, the clarity they need to do the job that we want them to do.
Now, once again, this doesn't substantiate why the ban is the only option. We've heard some references that obviously there are other ways that these issues can be combated, but we've still not had any clarification, and we don't get any clarification why the ban is the only option they're pursuing. The reality is the ban is the most extreme measure. I think we can all agree on that. But there are things that can be done, like government training programs about digital safety for children. All of this sort of stuff exists. Parental controls, ISPs being legally required to send out a leaflet with home routers when they're delivered about how to activate parental controls, things like that. They're little laws that I think we could probably all get behind, like actually having government programs that are about digital privacy and protecting your children online. But none of this stuff has been touched on. None of it has been touched on. And throughout the 2 hours of this debate, they weren't topics that were really drilled home, which is actually, I sit here as a YouTuber being argumentative, but more than anything, it's really disappointing. Like, there's actual things that can be done today, right now, as we speak, to help protect children online that aren't being done, and instead they're too busy chasing this dystopian future of people handing over their identification to utilize social media. It's really, 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 really makes me ashamed of our government.
There clearly are some young people who benefit from accessing social media. Is that your experience? And how would you try and trade off the potential benefits against the harm that you've described? Perhaps Becky first.
No, I wouldn't say the benefits are of huge interest to us at the moment in light of the harms.
And this is actually kind of one of the points I want to drill home. I want to be very clear here, full respect to this woman and the job she does. She works with children, she's a GP, she's seen a lot of things about this particular topic, and I'm not trying to discredit her opinion on this. Her opinion on this is just as valid as anyone's opinion on this, of course it is. But she goes on to talk about these aren't small incidences, and then brings up the topic of, animal harm, where there was an instance where a child had seen a video that was shown to him by his friend, and that video made him go home and kill his puppies.
Because the harms are not just small incidences for a few children. Cruelty to animals, cruelty to each other, sexploitation, violent acts, increased criminalisation of children.
Now, this isn't a widespread thing that's breaking out in the UK and that loads of children are doing this. This was one example out of many. Then at the same time, she says that she's not mentioning isolated incidents. Well, that was an isolated incident. And then, to caveat that with the fact that she's not willing to accept any of the benefits to social media, and there are benefits to social media. I will admit there are definitely some serious downsides, but that's just looking at social media. If we look at things like requiring identification to access social media, then we actually start to talk about a national security issue that actually puts every adult and eventually children in harm's way. There are benefits to social media, of course there are, and there seems to be a focus here on what the parents think about children and social media, not necessarily what children think of social media, because I know that children will utilize social media to communicate with their friends, to confide in their friends, to have these conversations over long distance, or when they can't see their friends for certain reasons, or when children are having bad environments at home, social media becomes a way they can communicate with the outside world and their friends. And I think more than ever, it's becoming very important for society, not necessarily a complete good thing, of course not, but to downplay the importance that it actually has in everyday life now it's not very genuine, is it? And then we talk about the violent acts.
Cruelty to animals, cruelty to each other, sexploitation, violent acts, increased criminalisation of children.
So there's actually been a recent documentary done by Ross Kemp, and I would urge you to go and watch it. It's actually about incels and how, internet culture and things on the internet lead to violent acts. And throughout that documentary, Ross Kemp kind of gets this big turn of events where he actually finds out that all of the data shows that things like video games, online content, and all of this stuff doesn't actually lead to physical violent acts. What actually leads to physical violent acts is people that are predisposed to that sort of behavior anyway. And it's not necessarily social media that makes them tick or things that are online that make them tick. It's something within them that was always going to happen regardless. And I think it's an interesting point to counteract that social media just leads to everyone being violent. That's not the case at all.
You hear teachers, police and doctors incredibly worried that a lot of this has been provoked or directly caused by social media. In that context, I'm less interested in the benefits because there are other ways for children to communicate.
And you say that there's other ways for children to communicate, and she actually references later on by, texting your friends instead of using platforms like WhatsApp. Well, WhatsApp is just a texting platform. And this is where we go back to the definitions of social media. If social media, and this does actually come up repeatedly, social media is now being boiled down to even messaging anyone directly, then no, there aren't any other online ways to communicate with your friends. If you're going to ban games, social media, which is everything, text messages, and potentially even things like direct one-on-one contact like phone calls, you are excluding children from the digital landscape. The digital landscape, which now more than ever is actually more important for children's development when it comes to them actually learning how to coexist with the digital world.
In that context, I'm less interested in the benefits because there are other ways for children to communicate. There may be benefits in this, which we are more than willing to look at if you remove the harms. I'm not interested in the benefits in light of where we are now. No, I find it quite troubling that it's stalling us.
But then you've already said twice there that you're not willing to look at the benefits. Then you're saying you're willing to look at the benefits. It kind of sounds like you don't really care about any of the benefits. You won't consider them, look at them or anything because you're so focused on the harms, which is of course understandable to an extent. But if you're going to be sat in Parliament making decisions about the future of the internet, the harms shouldn't be the only thing that you look at. You need to look at the other side of the argument to be able to build up that compromise in the middle to help evaluate your position on this better. If you're not willing to look at information that you don't agree with, that kind of explains why all of your surveys just say that the internet is harmful for every child ever and everything is social media and everything's bad.
And I know the fun that can be had on family WhatsApps, and the WhatsApp probably would escape any restrictions or bans because if it's shown to be benign and useful to children, that's great. But TikTok and Instagram and the likes are dreadful.
You say that, but literally sat right behind you is Lorna Woods, the person that co-wrote the Online Safety Act, that knows that Instagram and Meta and WhatsApp and all these other companies all require people to verify their age to see things like adult content on these platforms. So what you're saying has already been dealt with. Like, these surveys that they're referencing, by the way, all took place before the Online Safety Act came into effect. I personally believe, in my opinion, that they need to carry out all of these surveys again and recollect all of this data because the digital landscape now is vastly different to what it was when this data was collected.
Just back to Frank on that point about whether there are benefits and there will be groups that will be disadvantaged by a ban.
We actually polled parents on this just as much as we asked parents, what are the harms you're seeing, what are your concerns. Only 5% of parents said they felt social media helped their children access support for personal issues, and only 8% mentioned positive influences from social media. So I think that reflects the very low incidence of parents saying actually there are benefits to social media versus perhaps the wider online experience.
I hear about parents, but what about young people themselves?
Well, I think we have to be very careful where we're talking about potentially vulnerable young people, potentially young people who are exploring their sexuality. We have to be clear that we're not proposing to ban the internet or places where young people can receive advice. We need to make sure that those places where they receive advice are either moderated, we remove any sort of Wild West danger to those places, or that they are carefully controlled by groups who have, we would respect as offering good advice.
Hopefully you're starting to get a bit of a picture now of what's really going on here. What they're suggesting is that the only websites where children can receive advice about things like sexuality and medical help advice are websites that the government approves, which, we've seen in other countries over the years, and it's I'm getting a taste of dystopia in my mouth there. But what we're actually getting at here is that they only really care about what parents think, and to be honest, they are part of an organisation, just to be clear, that work on behalf of parents, not children. Like, they work on behalf of parents in aid of children, but the truth is that they haven't spoke to children about what they enjoy about social media, what benefits it brings to them. They've basically asked parents about what they think their children are doing on social media. Very different questions with, I'm sure, very, very, very different answers.
Drop-in and session, and there was an example raised there by a colleague where a young girl logged onto a static website which had suicide content on it, and then she was bombarded by emails, and sadly the story did not end well.
See, I think this is because obviously they're in a rush to get points across, this story requires so much more context. Like, you don't just visit a website and then the next week off yourself. You have to be predisposed and have existing kind of mental queries going on that would lead you to go to one place to another in such very short succession of time. Visiting a website doesn't cause someone to do something so horrific. And the reality is majority, in fact 99.99 something percent of that sort of, content is available on the dark web, not the surface web, which is the thing that they're looking at regulating. It's very important to understand the stark differences between the two, and the fact that this very legislation will push people towards those darker parts of the internet where they will find that sort of content.
So again, this is not defined as social media. So that is one question I'd really want to pin you down on. The second thing is I am concerned about this, your answer about parenting responsibility, and the state can do that instead of the parents. So two very quick questions. A survey said 50% of parents just would not comply with this ban, and so you would create an in and out group of those that have access and those haven't. Huge issues with bullying there. And also, what's your opinion on parents putting their children on social media, aka influencers using their children for that purpose? If a child can't access social media, should parents be allowed to put their children on social media?
Okay, all right.
I think on the issue of parents putting their own children onto social media, clearly, there has to be a freedom for parents to make their own decisions.
Right. So to be 1,000,000% clear, we're talking about not allowing children to access things like WhatsApp to talk to their friends, not allowing to access games, social media, any of the stuff. But you're saying it's up to parents whether they upload pictures of their children on the internet. What?
I think on the point of parents not complying with any ban, I think that data was taken at a point of time where a ban hasn't been enacted, and polling will only ever tell you what people think right now. It is a snapshot.
When you present polling as evidence for a ban, you can't then negate polling as evidence where a ban might not work.
That is a Totally valid point. All the evidence they've presented so far is without the under 16 social media ban being in effect. Yet evidence is presented without the ban being in effect, and immediately the side that want the social media ban are saying that that evidence can be discounted because the ban isn't in effect. Apps like, what is going on here? Now, this is where things get really juicy, and just watch.
Social media definition, can I pin you down? Because this is a huge area. You said you don't want to ban from the internet, but I've given some examples where actually that what would not be classified as social media could be classified as delivering harms. So, you know, social media, what do you mean? How do you see a ban being
Alison, we're going to have to move on. So can you answer that quickly?
So it's more age gating, raising the age for appropriate reasons.
Yeah, great. But raising the age on what? What is social media?
The technicality of defining what constitutes social media and how does AI fit in, how does gaming fit in, well, it needs a broad scope and a list of definitions so that you can go in and target who is potentially in breach.
So what is the list of definitions? You're talking about implementing a ban, and like this guy's freaking out, he's having a drink, but you're talking about implementing a ban on something that you haven't defined. Like, you haven't defined what social media is. How can you institute a piece of legislation and then not define it? Australia is currently having the exact same issue. They introduced their social media ban in December of last year, and now they are completely locking heads with so many different organizations, companies, social media companies, gaming companies, and platforms because no clear definitions have been set out. And it's actually ended up with a large part of that enforcement not even coming into effect because they don't know how to regulate it, because they didn't set out any clear definitions. And even when Australia was discussing it in their parliamentary system, they still had the exact same issues where no one could define what social media is.
It can involve all user-to-user messaging, so that might be through Fortnite, Coldplay, Line of Duty.
Coldplay and Line of Duty. Come on, know what you're talking about. Know what you're talking about, please.
All those sorts of things, Minecraft, anything where strangers can access our children. That user-to-user definition does actually cross the divide over various AI, gaming, social media platforms. I'm a doctor, so this is out of my lane.
No, this isn't out of your lane. You're a doctor that has specialised in dealing with children, which is why you're sat where you are. The viewpoint that you have on this is important to the conversation, and you are very important to the conversation, which is why you should be able to actually deliver what these deliverables are for this legislation. Like, you know, you can talk all you want about harms to children and you can bring that in front of people, and I understand that, and I respect a lot of the points that have been raised, but then we're still left with the same question at the end of it. What are you legislating? Because if you don't know, what's the point in passing the law? Anyway, I need to go and have a nap. This is the problem with a lot of conversations that happen in Parliament. They discuss legislation that they don't even know what they're aiming for. You should lay out your base legislation with all of the rules and all the criteria for it, then debate that. Because at the moment, you're debating something that you can't define, which is, to be honest, a waste of taxpayer time, a waste of your time, and it's not adding any fuel to the conversation around children's safety online. There are ways that children should and need to be protected online, and an under 16 social media ban is so vague and so pointless that it's not going to address the issues. What you're doing is just parenting from the government, where parents need to be educated, because you educate parents to educate their children, who in the future will educate their children. Anyway, if you did enjoy watching, please make sure to like and subscribe. And also, while you're down there, go and check out Private Internet Access VPN to get 4 months free and 86% off. Thanks for watching, and I shall see you all in the next video.